We now turn to the music of James Brown. And the strange, in terms of the discussion that we've already been having, the strange kind of situation where James Brown, in his music, makes hardly any concessions to what might be thought of as preferences in white taste. Nevertheless, he releases record after record in the 1960s, the 1970s that cross over onto the pop charts and have tremendous success. So how can this be? How can this be when Berry Gordy Jr. Had it all sort of worked out what it would take to get these records to cross over, that James Brown, who's not doing any of those kinds of things, is having such success? Well, let's talk about the career of James Brown, because he's a very interesting figure, not only in the history of black pop, but certainly in the history of American pop music in the 20th century. His early career, James Brown was born in South Carolina, but raised in southern Georgia. He had regional success in the mid-1950s with his group, the Fabulous Flames, who were booked by Little Richard's manager. Little Richard, remember, came out of the southern Georgia area as well. And in fact, when Little Richard's Tutti Frutti caught on nationally, and all of a sudden he was a hit artist and all that kind of thing, the manager for Little Richard still had a bunch of gigs booked that Little Richard was supposed to do, but he didn't want Little Richard to do them because he wanted to send him off to do television dates and other kinds of things that were out of Georgia, and out of the region, and much bigger. And so actually James Brown did those gigs for Little Richard. And I can't tell you for sure whether or not they even bothered to tell the people who bought the tickets that wasn't Little Richard they were seeing. But nevertheless, James Brown got one of his first big breaks by sort of being Little Richard at gigs that had been booked for Richard. James Brown's first big hits, Please, 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 number 6 on the R&B charts in 1956. James Brown was signed to King Records in Cincinnati, which was run by Sid Nathan, and had a very long-standing relationship with King Records in Cincinnati and with Sid Nathan, who became a kind of a mentor figure to James Brown in many ways. James Brown's music in the 1950s is mostly in the doo-wop style. If you listen to Please, 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 I think you'll say that it sounds an awful lot like some of the other doo-wop of the era. Maybe a little sort of rawer in a certain kind of way, because already there's that kind of passionate, enthusiastic James Brown vocal sound, kind of this sort of aggressive vocal of his, a little bit over the top with the pleading on the Please, Please, Please. But we will begin to see a change in that style when we get into the 1960s. Before we talk about that, though, it's important to acknowledge the central role of the stage show in the James Brown experience, often referred to as the hardest working man in show business. By the early 1960s, James Brown's stage show was kind of famous on the R&B circuit, having a lot of the elements in it that we have come to associate with James Brown through the years. Not only his athletic dancing. Remember, we talked about the Temptations before and how sort of athletic and advanced their dance steps were. Well, James Brown was another guy who really did the athletic steps. In fact, when Michael Jackson was just a little kid, whenever James Brown was on the television, his mom would make him get in front of the television and watch James Brown, and Michael Jackson said how he was sort of transported by James Brown, who was the master. And so in many ways, we heard to think about Michael Jackson, who developed not only as a child star, but into the late 70s and certainly into the 80s. A lot of that is taken from this sort of James Brown, very sort of physical form of dance moves that he did. And the other thing that's famous for James Brown, if you've never seen this, you should look up a video on the internet of this, is the routine he has at the close of a concert. At the close of a concert, he acts like he's so exhausted by the concert that he's somehow delirious. And his roadies come on and they put like a coat or a jacket or a robe or something on him, and they start to lead him off as if, if they didn't lead him off, he wouldn't know what to do or he'd fall down. And he almost gets off the stage, then all of a sudden he throws the coat off and runs back to the stage and grabs the microphone. He's got some more energy left in him. It does that a number of times. And people came to expect this, and so it became sort of like a kind of thing where if he didn't do it 5 or 6 times, people really didn't feel like they got their money's worth at the end, But it became his thing of saying, I'm giving you every ounce of what I have tonight because that's how important the audience is to me. And it became really his trademark routine. That stage show and really became a big part of what it was to experience the musical expression of James Brown during those years. And so maybe it's not surprising that when they started thinking about ways that they could build James Brown's career, they decided, well, they would do a live album. In fact, that album was released in the fall of 1963, went to number 2 in the pop charts, called Live at the Apollo, which was essentially James Brown doing what he was doing at that time live at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. It really showcases his range and captures his energy, and it's maybe one of the most important sort of early documents we have of James Brown as a sort of important crossover figure. And already we're talking about 1963. Here's a guy singing in an unabashedly sort of black style, singing for a black audience in a part of the city that's largely black, and he's got an album that's number 2 on the pop charts in 1963. Now, probably should say that back in those days, album sales were not what they were later. I mean, the album was really kind of a secondary thing. It really was a business about hit singles at that time. But still, that's a pretty doggone good performance for 1963 with James Brown. And we start to see in 1960 his music starts to become more soul influenced. He sort of leaves the doo-wop thing behind. James Brown's often known as the godfather of soul. And so we start to get this tight and driving style where the groove is driven forward by the bass and the instruments, the bass, the guitar, the drums, really sort of getting into kind of a great kind of groove that has all of the instruments sort of interlaced into almost like every instrument is a kind of a percussion instrument, and the whole tune kind of sort of rides on this groove. And on top of this groove, you have to imagine James is doing his dance steps, but he's also doing these lyrics that are sort of, sort of innocuous, repetitive, sometimes a little bit crazy or outrageous, but he's definitely not trying to tell a story or talk about his emotional relationship with a woman or any of the other kinds of things that pop songs do. It's almost like the lyrics themselves are kind of extraneous, and the voice itself becomes another element in the percussion element, in the percussion sort of fabric of these fantastic grooves that his music develops during that time. In 1964, we hear Out of Sight, one that everybody knows. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, a number 1 hit in R&B charts, number 8 in the pop charts in 1965. I Got You, I Feel Good is from 1965. It's a Man's World from 1966, and Cold Sweat from 1967, all a very identifiable style. When you hear a James Brown record come out in the 60s, it can only be one person, and that's James Brown. Music business people will tell you that's one of the most valuable features to have, is a real kind of sonic trademark. Once people hear just a few seconds of that record, they know who it is, and that's how those James Brown records were. And like I said before, one of the most interesting elements of it is that his music is so markedly black in a lot of kinds of ways. And we could, you might think about what constitutes markedly black. What are the musical features? If I didn't know this artist were black, how would I know from just listening to the music itself that he or she is? And it's an interesting kind of question. The more you think about it, the harder it is to really answer. But most of us, I think, really get a sense that we know what that is intuitively, even if it's very difficult for us to externalize or to articulate exactly what constitutes that. But whatever it is, his music was viewed as markedly black, but makes no concessions to white taste. So then why was it so popular with white audiences? And I think it's because he had that characteristic kind of sound that was his own kind of trademark, with the emphasis on the groove and the rhythmic hipness of what was going on, the drive of it, with that kind of aggressive vocal and the lyrics that were almost nonsensical in some sense, just sort of kind of funny, maybe if you thought about it, and not particularly kind of serious. There was nothing really threatening in the blackness of what James Brown was doing. It all just seemed to be a fantastic celebration of the groove and the music that was going on at the time. So while Berry Gordy is going for elegance, James Brown is going just for the pure feel of his music. These groups of his were so highly rehearsed that he had a reputation for actually fining members of the band if they made a mistake. They would rehearse like crazy, so they got all this sort of intense rhythmic interplay absolutely perfect. And if somebody made a mistake on the bandstand, he would point to that person, and afterwards he would dock their pay for the gig because they'd made a mistake. Now, how often that happened, I don't know. Everybody tells stories, you never know what to believe. But the idea is that people thought that was the case, and so they thought that meant that band was more thoroughly rehearsed than many other groups would have many other groups would have been at the time. They had a reputation for excellence. Now, as we close this week and start to think about the way forward in part two, when we talk about black pop in the 1970s, one of the most important events in black culture, American culture really, in the 60s, but certainly it has an effect on the music business and on the history of black pop, is the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. That happens in April of 1968. And in many ways, it's considered a kind of turning point, not just in the black community, but really in black music. Even the guys in the Stax studio, Steve Cropper said after that day, things were just a little bit different in the studio. Even though there'd never been any kind of racial tension among the people working at Stax, there was just something was different after 1968. And so you would think this would make certain artists angry, or maybe more menacing in a certain kind of way, the anger about Dr. King's assassination. The fact there were riots around the country, and people were outraged, and there was a new kind of racial tension in the country in the wake of this terrible event. And this idea of black pride began to rise. And you would think that maybe for somebody like James Brown, this would be a tough situation for him to be in, but on the other hand, James Brown became one of the great peacemakers of the end of the 1960s. In fact, the day after the assassination of Martin Luther King, he was scheduled to do a concert at the Boston Garden. Now, the city, the mayor and those thought maybe it's not a good idea to get a bunch of young people together the day after, we got riots in other cities, maybe we shouldn't do this. So what they decided to do was they decided to televise the concert for free. So anybody who wanted to watch the James Brown concert could watch it in the Boston area. They didn't have to go down to the Boston Garden. So only a few thousand people actually went down to the Boston Garden to see the show. They got all the good seats right in front. But it was broadcast on television. And that performance is the reputation of it is that it helped bring the Boston community together, black and white together, through James Brown's efforts, and really in many ways sort of quelling a riot in Boston and trying to get people to think about understanding. Now, we're going to return to a discussion of Motown and James Brown in part two of this course when we get to the music of black pop of the 1970s. But in our next and final week, we're going to talk about the music of psychedelia at the end of the 1960s. What happens when rock music goes psychedelic?